This just in, apparently there is such a thing as a free lunch. Today we're going to be doing a video review of Unlearning Economics. Free stuff is good, actually.
TV this morning before I came on, and I saw one group advocating free hearing tests for the 40s and 50s, and another group advocating free bereavement counselling in schools. Nobody's kind of against those things, but when we are spending and taxing and accumulating debt so much, we've got to stop all trying to give each other free stuff.
West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin says we cannot spend our way to a balanced, healthy economy and continue adding to our $30 trillion national debt. Getting inflation under control will require more aggressive action.
The bigger the government, the smaller the citizen.
Because welfare is anti-work and anti-marriage, it inherently harms the very people it was supposed to help, especially children.
What the welfare system and other kinds of governmental programs are doing is paying people to fail. Insofar as they fail, they receive the money. Insofar as they succeed, even to a moderate extent, the money is taken away.
Education and healthcare are some of the most important values we have in the world. The last people you want running it is the government. They have no incentive to make it work well. You don't have a customer relationship. There's no competition. There's no innovation.
The next time a politician proposes a generous new government benefits program, the first question should be, where is the money going to come from to pay for it?
So far, this video is making a lot of solid points.
It seems all people want these days is free stuff. They expect the government to solve all their problems. Health, education, housing, jobs, bills, food. There's no area of life government spending hasn't touched. This means lazy and inefficient bureaucrats deciding where your money goes instead of believing in the power of individuals and the free market. But you're in luck, because here at Unlearning Economics, we've put all the evidence together and found that spending by governments is guilty of, first, making long-term investments in things like universal education, childcare, and healthcare. Second, ensuring the population against risks to their health and standard of living. Wait a minute. That sounds quite good, actually.
So children get hungry this summer.
It's now common knowledge that our welfare system has itself become a poverty trap.
Free stuff is good, actually. Don't believe what you heard about free stuff.
Hey everyone, let's talk a little bit about social spending and free stuff. When I say free stuff, I mean social spending which is funded by governments and is free at the point of use. But that's less catchy. It's not uncommon for the notion of free stuff to be mocked. During Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, you probably heard a lot of, oh yeah, and maybe everyone should get a pony too. Let's put aside that buying everyone a pony is relatively affordable, coming to at most 15% of existing government spending in the USA, or 1/3 of the defense budget. The question being asked here is a fair one. How will we pay for it? The argument against social spending goes something like this. Surely, we can't just promise free stuff to people, because it has to be paid for somewhere, with taxes, which will only drag down growth, or with government borrowing, which will only indebt future generations. Getting free stuff will also engineer a culture of dependency where no one works for anything any goddamn more. Plus,
So the primary reason that I would oppose free stuff is because it means taxes. It means that the state has to coerce somebody into paying for it. And it's quite simply wrong to use violence as a means of obtaining somebody else's money. You also have issues like with healthcare in the United States where the government funds Medicare and Medicaid. So this is a massive amount of artificial demand which drives up the prices. Government spending tends to be highly inefficient. Nobody spends somebody else's money as carefully as they spend their own. They don't have the incentive to. There's also another issue, which is that when you empower the government to give free stuff to people, well, you can't guarantee that that's how the money's going to be used in future years. that's entirely up to whoever's in control of the state apparatus. So maybe that money is used for social spending one year and used for foreign aid or war in the Middle East the next. You don't really have any control over that because the funding is done coercively. You have to pay it or you go to jail. You can't really control how your money is being used when it's going to the government like you can when it's going to a corporation. It's also just unfair. It's unfair for the state to redistribute wealth, to take from one person to spend for another. Wealth doesn't just happen, it's created. And the people who create that wealth deserve to own it, deserve to spend it, deserve to have control over that wealth. So there's an issue of fairness and justice as well, when the state uses its power of taxation to redistribute wealth from the economic class to the political class or to everybody. With welfare state spending in particular, there's absolutely the issue of dependency. There's a large amount of people that don't work anymore, that live off government benefits, and as a result, they're politically beholden to social democrat politicians that promise them and give them all this free stuff, and they're a burden on society, a burden on the economic class, both economically and politically. There's also the issue of utility. So when the state taxes us and then spends our money on our behalf, because surely it's not all redistributive. That the argument being made by proponents of government spending is that the state can spend our money more wisely than we can. But as they teach us in economics, individuals have various ends, ordered ends. So, for example, your first ends might be paying your rent, and then your second ends might be buying food for the week. Then maybe you need some clothes, diaper for your kid, other priorities. You have all these high priority things that you want to spend your money on that's going to give you the maximum utility. If you really love Bon Jovi, maybe you would go to a Bon Jovi concert. It's going to be different for every person. But there's certain things that give you the most satisfaction, the most utility, and that's what you spend that's your highest priority. That's what you spend your money on. Or some people might be more long-term oriented. They like to save and invest their money, buy mutual funds or stocks or ETF or whatever. But the point is, when you spend your money on yourself, it goes to creating the greatest amount of utility towards the highest satisfaction or happiness to the individual. But when the state taxes me and then spends my money on myself, it's not going to anything that I want or that's my highest priority. It's going to whatever the politicians decide is a good investment. And even if it goes to something that's decent, like healthcare or education, stuff that people generally agree is a good thing, it's going to go within the context of a state monopoly. And state monopolies are never going to provide as good of results as free market competition. That's why you look at public education, the results are getting worse every year and the costs are going up. It's a monstrous, bureaucratic, extremely expensive waste of time for everybody involved. You stick all these kids in a classroom and there's very little learning going on. You got lots of issues with drugs and gangs and violence and sex and it's just not a good environment for learning. So even when it's spent on things like education and healthcare, which are good things, things that a lot of people value, it's spent in a manner that does not produce as good as results as you would have if people were spending their own money in a marketplace and picking and choosing which is the highest value entrepreneur, in terms of delivering education for their particular child.
Union or something. If this were true, you would expect spending on things like education, health, welfare, housing, and childcare to be associated with a whole host of negative outcomes. It could be that social spending is a drag on GDP growth because governments are so wasteful and inefficient and taxes are so high. It could be that social spending reduces employment because people are incentivized not to work by all the free money. Ultimately, high government spending might lead to shorter, stupider, and unhappier lives for everyone down the line. In his book, Making Social Spending Work, Peter Linder reviews the evidence and finds virtually nothing to support these contentions. Social spending has achieved massive gains in literacy, health, and reducing poverty the world over. In almost every case, there is a notable absence of negative effects on growth, employment, life, and happiness. Let's take a look at this data in more depth, and I guess this is where things get a bit intense. This is what my videos are like, okay? This table shows how various measures of GDP growth correlate with social spending over different time periods in 21.
The primary issue with this research is the obsession over the GDP statistic. The problem is that GDP doesn't really measure the health of the economy. What it measures, depending on how you calculate it, but the most common way being the expenditure method, is spending. So part of that is government spending. And if government spending increases, especially if the money's, say, borrowed, then borrowed through the banking system, then GDP is going to increase. But this doesn't mean necessarily that the economy improved. If the government were to buy $1 trillion worth of cars and drive them into the ocean, that would be a massive boost in GDP, but the real wealth of the nation would have decreased. This is why military Keynesianism, the idea that World War II ended the Great Depression, doesn't make a lot of sense. Producing weapons of war, going overseas, blowing them up, having a bunch of your soldiers die, this is not conducive to long-term economic growth. But it may be conducive to an increase in GDP because what's being measured is spending, not the strength of the economy. I mean, if you want to take a step further and take a real meta-analysis, there is no point in collecting statistics on the economy. The only reason to collect statistics on the economy is so you can plan the economy, and central economic planning does not work. We don't need statistics because we already know what is the best political approach to having a strong economy, and that is limited government. Get the government out of the way, allow the private sector room to grow, and that grows the economy. That's why there's a pretty much direct correlation between economic freedom and prosperity.
That is, rich countries. The rows show the time period. For example, the first row is the 1960s and the second is the 1970s. The columns show the three different measures. First, growth rates of GDP per person each year. Second, the overall level of GDP per person each year. And third, the overall level of GDP per person at the end of the decade. While the first column measures changes in GDP, the latter two columns measure the total amount. And while the first two columns are done on a year-by-year basis, the third one is supposed to measure the cumulative effect over a decade. The little a's and b's are important because they indicate if the correlations are statistically significant. For instance, the correlation between social spending and the GDP level in the same year for the 1990s is plus 0.47 and is statistically significant with 95% confidence. Social spending and the GDP level by the end of the decade is plus 0.65 and is again statistically significant, this time with 99% confidence. The correlation between GDP growth and social spending from 2007 to 2014 is minus 0.09.
And yet if you look at nations that had very little government spending, social spending, like Hong Kong or Singapore, you see growth rates that far exceed anything in more welfare state-oriented countries.
And is not statistically significant. In fact, looking first at the column for GDP growth rates, you can see that none of the correlations are statistically significant. The values are slightly negative on average, but this is likely just noise. It seems that the growth of GDP and social spending do not have an obvious relationship from this data. Looking at the second and third columns, we can see that the correlations are universally positive, and many of them are statistically significant. This implies that social spending has a positive relationship with the overall GDP level, both on a year-by-year basis and on a decade-by-decade basis. I wouldn't read too much into this positive effect, though. The important point is that the purported catastrophic negative effects of social spending just aren't easily visible. These are just simple correlations, but if there were a negative correlation between GDP and social spending, I could at least see where critics of social spending got their views from. Even with this low bar, there are just no obvious negative effects or examples of it holding countries back. This remains true if you try to correlate social spending with employment levels, self-reported happiness, or play with other measures. Yet investment in healthcare and education...
I mean, if you look at economic growth rates in the 19th century, at least in America, they were substantially higher than before the welfare state spending, government regulation got introduced. Wage rates were increasing a lot faster as well.
Has led to longer, happier, and more productive lives for millions of people the world over. Still, this is just a starting point. We'll need to look at more in-depth evidence before we conclude that free stuff is good, actually. By the way, I'll be using free stuff, social spending, and government spending somewhat interchangeably in this video. Governments have a unique role within economies. Unlike private companies, individuals, unions, or even local governments, national governments have a stake in a wide range of social and economic outcomes. This means that spending on education, health, and welfare can have knock-on effects, which ultimately benefit society and the government down the line. In some cases, the eventual benefits will even outweigh the costs of the original spending.
Yes, the mythical Keynesian multiplier. Why do these guys never factor the multiplier effect of the taxes that are forced to pay for these programs?
Two main reasons to love social spending. First, it makes long-term investments in things like universal education, childcare, and healthcare on a scale that the private sector won't. Secondly, it provides social insurance for the population against risks to their health and standard of living more generally.
But isn't a booming economy where one can easily get a good job, a better insurance, better safety net?
We use three main examples of social spending: education, healthcare, and welfare payments like universal basic income. And we're going to do things in that order. So yes, this video has quite a lot of content, but there are plenty of Simpsons clips to break it up.
Have some money.
In 1807, a bill to extend education to the poor was proposed in UK Parliament. The Tory MP, Davies Giddy, spoke out against it.
Giving education to the labouring classes of the poor would, in effect, be found to be prejudicial to their morals and happiness. It would teach them to despise their lot in life, instead of making them good servants in agriculture and other laborious employments to which their rank in society had destined them. Instead of teaching them subordination, it would render them factious and refractory, as was evident in the manufacturing counties. It would enable them to read seditious pamphlets, vicious books, and publications against Christianity. It would render them insolent to their superiors.
I like how this guy's portrait perfectly fits his political views. That feeling when you take things from the poor, lol. Giddy was right about some things. Education allowed workers to leave agriculture and get jobs in manufacturing. It tended to reduce support for Tories, and it probably aided the decline of religion. But he was wrong when he said,
besides, if the bill were to pass into a law, it would go to burthen the country with a most enormous and incalculable expense, and to load the industrious orders of society with still heavier imposts.
Firstly, the taxes themselves were only 0.2% of national income, an eminently affordable sum. Secondly, estimates from back then show that educating the poor would have been a wise investment which likely paid for itself in the long run. This table shows estimates of the rates of return on schooling for the sons of labourers in Victorian England. These are in percentages, the extra money received from paying for your son's education through their eventual higher earnings. The columns show the different parties who might benefit from this investment. We are most interested in the second column, which shows the rate of return for a private family investing in schooling, and the fourth column, which shows the rate of return for the government investing in schooling. As the table states, the first 3 years of schooling would have achieved signature literacy. Men are called grooms here for some reason, and the dates on the far right are when these grooms started schools as sons. It's a little confusing, but it's cool data, so let's stick with it. A private family investing in 3 years of schooling for its son in 1821 yielded a 19.5% return by 1840 when the son was a grown-up groom. For sons who started school in 1842, the return was 11% by 1868. These boys would benefit massively from having their education invested in. as it increased their future earnings by over 10% in each case. What's also interesting here is the fourth column, which shows the fiscal return to the government. The government could expect a 21.2% rate of return from investing in schooling in 1821 and a 6.5% rate of return for investing in schooling in 1842. This is because higher earnings for the sons meant higher tax income for the government once the sons grew up and became grooms. As the fifth column shows, these rates of return were much higher than government borrowing costs. Education paid for itself, even if the government had to borrow to invest in that education.
Education benefited the children who got it and their families, and also benefited the government who paid for it. Davis Giddy was incorrect that this was unaffordable. That's right. A Tory MP was both callous and wrong. I'll give you a minute to process that revelation. You could even say that Davies was giddy to deny education to the masses. I'll show myself out. The economist Milton Friedman used to say, "There's no such thing as a free lunch."
It's the free lunch myth. The belief that somehow or other government can spend money at nobody's expense.
The idea is that if you spend money on something like public education, then you have to pay for it, which involves taxes, which are a drag on the economy. Friedman enjoyed quoting the 19th century economist Friedrich Bastiat.
I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a wonderful description of government that was made by a French economist by the name of...
That great fiction by which everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else.
Frederick Bastiat, about 150 years ago. He said, government is that fiction whereby everybody believes
Nailed it.
that he can live at the expense of everybody else.
The insight that education can pay for itself reframes our view of public spending. Public education enables people to lead better lives through learning and basic skills. It increases income for individuals and their families.
On the contrary, because the socialized model of education delivers inferior results to what a market would provide, government education does worse than what would happen if the government had no schools at all. So there's worse results for people, for their families, for the taxpayer who's forced to pay the outrageous prices charged by the public education system. When you have a state monopoly, there's no incentive for innovation, for improvement. There's no mechanism for improvement. Even if the teachers in a particular school wanted to improve on their classes, they couldn't. They're beholden to the curriculum. They're beholden to the monolithic, centralized model. You're telling me that this is the optimum system that they just happened to come up with? There's no chance. There's so many ways that school could be improved, primarily class sizes. You know, if you went from like 30 students to like 4, that would make a dramatic difference. Obviously, within the public sector schooling, there's no way that can happen. But market and education could absolutely provide that.
On top of all this, from the perspective of governments, public education pays for itself through higher future taxes, contradicting Friedman's dictum.
Peter Linder presents this simple historical diagram of how investment in education yields returns. In the past, countries...
Like, he's just making the assumption that if there wasn't public education, these people wouldn't get an education at all, which is nonsense. Maybe that would have been true in the 1800s, but today there's sufficient income that people would just send their kids to private schools, which, by the way, wouldn't necessarily be very expensive. Private schools are expensive in the present system because there's no market for education bargain hunters or frugal spenders in education because they have the free option of public education. So anybody who's concerned for their budget would just use the free public education. But absent that public system, then there would be a tremendous market for low cost but decent quality education.
Countries lack the fiscal capacity and political will to use tax money to extend education to the entire population. But
I mean, we really need to take a step back here and get the 1,000-yard view on the thing. I mean, this is taking for granted or assuming that the whole point of the public education system is to provide optimal education for our children. It's not. That is not the purpose. The primary function is to indoctrinate students into the ideology of statism. That's why the state has a monopoly on education. That's why it's one of the primary goals of the statist is to establish, one of the core tenets of the Communist Manifesto is public education, because that's very important in order to condition people towards this view that the state is very important, that it's a positive organization, and not criminal conspiracy on the part of the political class to rob the economic class.
Link A on the diagram. As a race, that is humanity, we managed this much later than we needed to. Selfish elites kept education from the masses for tens or even hundreds of years longer than necessitated by a lack of resources and knowledge. Once we began to spend money on education, the average years of schooling went up. That's link B on the diagram. Once years of schooling went up, so did the skills and knowledge of the population, or link C. And once the skills and knowledge of the population increased, so did their productivity and earning power. That's link D. This virtuous cycle also meant higher tax revenues for the governments that invested in the first place. We found the free lunch. All we needed to do was ensure universal provision of education to children. And if you think this only applies to early education in Victorian Britain, then you're going to be so embarrassed when I say what I'm about to say right now. It doesn't only apply to early education in Victorian Britain. Could have improved that script, didn't. There are plenty of other examples from across the globe. Linda highlights that Eastern European countries have roughly similar average incomes to Latin American countries, but due to higher spending on education, they tend to outperform Latin America on test scores. Education in the USA deserves singling out because it lags behind other education systems despite the high average income of the country. It may be the case that low funding is leaving a free lunch on the table for America. As well as not giving many children, disproportionately poor and or non-white, a good chance in life, the low funding per person in the USA could yield dividends if the government chose to invest more. To be clear, there are many other factors at play in US education, including a lack of centralization and standardization, ultra-religious schools, parents not having much choice beyond their local area, and that good old American spirit of sucking.
Don't ask me. I don't know anything. I'm product of American education system. I also build poor quality cars and inferior style electronics.
Oh, they got our number.
So far, I've actually understated the case for investment in education. Primary and secondary school probably pay for themselves by increasing the earnings of the children when they are adults. But they have effects beyond this. Education can improve health, reduce criminality, and generally facilitate a modern society. As a wise man once put it,
A stable and democratic society is impossible without widespread acceptance of some common set of values and without a minimum degree of literacy and knowledge on the part of most citizens. Education contributes to both. In consequence, the gain from the education of a child accrues not only to the child or his parents, but to other...
This is nonsense. The public school system is a joke. It delivers terrible results. You look at how many adults graduate from public schools that are functionally illiterate. You've got huge class sizes, and they dumb down the lessons to the lowest common denominator. They don't even fail students anymore. They just pass them along, pretend like they're achieving something. The whole system is unnecessarily bureaucratic. They're following a monolithic, centralized model, and it could be dramatically improved on. In particular, you need different approaches for different students. Different people learn in different ways. The idea that you can just put 30 random people into a classroom, teach them all the same method, and that's going to be optimal is insane. So what we really need is a marketed education. That way, different schools, different teachers can attempt different styles and see what works best with various students. Parents can determine, whether their children are getting a good education or not when they go to a particular school. whether a particular style of teaching or pedagogical approach meshes with their child and their child's needs. And because it's a market, there's going to be competition in terms of making sure that you don't have wasteful government or wasteful spending. You know, the public schools, there's so much bureaucracy, so many additional staff, and everything is done in the most expensive fashion because they have to justify their budgets and they spend every dollar in their budgets every year. So the end cost to the taxpayer is crazy for the low quality result.
Members of the society. The education of my child contributes to other people's welfare by promoting a stable and democratic society. Yet it is not feasible to identify the particular individuals or families benefited or the money value of the benefit, and so to charge for the services rendered. There is therefore a significant neighborhood effect.
You said it, brother. Wait, you said that? There are lots of ways of thinking about this, but the dominant way is positive externalities. These are sometimes called spillover effects or neighborhood effects, as Friedman called them. Positive externalities are cases where there are benefits to economic activity beyond the original buyers and sellers. They may sound good because positive is a good word, but actually they can lead to problems. The issue is that because so many of these benefits are spread out across society, they seem invisible or impossible to calculate. As highlighted by Friedman, universal public education has myriad positive externalities. For example, knowing that anyone you try to hire or who tries to hire you will have basic...
Again, this assumes that either there wouldn't be private schools in the absence of public schools, or that the public schools would be better than the private schools. But neither of those assumptions are justified. Absent state provision of education, just like absent state provision of food in the Soviet Union, people didn't just stop eating and starve to death. They just purchased their own food. So likewise, they would just purchase their own education. I mean, the vast majority of families can afford sending a child to school, and those who can't, you know, then you could have charity scholarships and the like. So there might be a case for charity or for a program or whatever to ensure that the people whose families can't necessarily afford tuition fees are taken care of. But that's the small subset of the population. It doesn't make sense to design the whole system with only them in mind. You gotta ask, what's going to provide the better result? A state monopoly on education or competing schools in a marketplace? So if the competing schools is the better system, then that's going to have the more knock-on effects or the more positive externalities.
Basic numerical skills and will speak and write fluently is invaluable. If we rely on market mechanisms, education is likely to be underprovided because of the invisibility.
Just look at how dumbed down education's got in the last 90 years. People used to learn the classics. They used to learn Latin and nowadays, you know, people can't even write an essay. They're using ChatGPT.
Of this broad social return. Historically, it just hasn't been profitable to provide a basic minimum of education for everyone. We therefore need provision or subsidization of positive externalities like education if we want to have enough of them. There's an extremely interesting study by Hendren and Sprung-Kaiser which reviews social spending policies in the USA. We're going to keep coming back to this study, so remember it, because it demonstrates about as definitively as possible that social spending can achieve the broad benefits we're talking about in this video. Social spending like this makes long-term investments and harnesses positive externalities. And one of Hendren and Sprung-Kaiser's findings is that investments in education pay for themselves over a wide range of ages. Here are 3 examples. First, the Perry Preschool program, which targeted young children from disadvantaged African-American backgrounds. This was a high-quality program with a high teacher-student ratio and had massive positive effects on later life outcomes, including education, income, criminal activity, and health. It was also a randomized study, which means the effects were likely to be causal. Second, the increases in funding per pupil for schools at K-12 level. This is kindergarten up to year 12, in other words, standard schooling years. A 70s and 80s campaign tried to equalize funding between schools by redistributing. As the typical comments I get on my videos, the top few would be something like,
"You're British."
Please debate.
Communists suck.
Economists suck.
In Chapter 1 of Capital, Marx lays out...
Please do a video about healthcare.
So, this is me doing part of a video about one main aspect of healthcare. Specifically, we're going to spend a fair amount of time on the implications of healthcare for social spending. I'm going to tell you why it should be on the list of free stuff: universal, publicly funded in at least some ways, and free at the point of use. I'm not going to analyze pharmaceutical companies or solve all of the problems in the US health system, although we will talk about the latter in the next section. In a way, public health is the mother of all positive externalities. There are massive human and economic gains to governments investing in these things, and individually we either can't or won't do it on a big scale. When a disease sweeps through a population, many of our actions suddenly take on new meaning because they affect everyone else. The pandemic has taught us how interconnected we are and how failing to have vaccines or other preventative measures will result in massive costs down the line. Hey, you know who also acknowledged this? Milton Friedman.
There is room for some public health activities to prevent contagion.
The truth is that many efforts to maintain public health are just better done collectively. According to Peter Linder, people first started to realize this in the 19th century.
An understanding that cholera and typhoid spread through polluted water came in the 1850s. Shortly afterwards, scientists confirmed that bacterial and viral pathogens caused diseases. Vaccines to prevent infectious diseases arrived in the 1890s. Then, public health campaigns became commonplace in the United Kingdom and United States, where people were taught the importance of washing hands and disinfecting water, among other lifestyle changes, to prevent the spread of disease. State and local governments played a critical role by promoting health campaigns, cleaning the water supply, and building sewage facilities.
More recently, the turnaround in the country of Rwanda shows the benefits of investment in public health most starkly. As I'm talking about Rwanda, content warning for extreme violence. I'm not going to go into detail, but I will describe the background history, so be warned and go to here to skip the whole thing. In 1994, Rwanda saw one of the worst genocides in history. Ethnic cleansing against the Tutsis led to the deaths of 1 million people, while the world basically did nothing. As tragic as the initial violence was, the genocide had similarly awful, long-lasting effects. During the genocide, 250,000 women were estimated to have been raped. There was a massive resultant spread of HIV, which was actually used as a weapon. There was also an epidemic of cholera in the refugee camps and low rates of vaccination against measles and polio, all of which led to the highest infant mortality rate in the world. For years after, many saw Rwanda as a basket case. Starting in 2004, the new government created a plan called Vision 2020 to try and become a middle-income country by that date. This may have been a lofty goal, but they did a pretty good job. One factor in Rwanda's success was its massive investment in health to combat the problems created during the genocide. Rwanda dedicated over 20% of government expenditure to public health, which was over 10% of their GDP. You can see the success of this investment most clearly from what happened with HIV and with the antiretroviral treatment ART. On this graph, the red line shows the rate of AIDS-related deaths over time, which rose just before the genocide, reached almost 300 per 100,000 people.
The thing about public health care is it's really the same as public education. You get inferior results when you have a socialized model. You look at Canada, for example. Canada has pretty much socialized medicine. About 99% of the health care is paid for through the government, through government programs. And the results are massive waiting lists. A lot of people dying every year, thousands of people dying every year, waiting to see a specialist, waiting to get MRI tested. So we've seen a massive growth in medical tourism, people going south of the border or even to other countries like Mexico, Panama, Colombia, or Southeast Asia, where they have functioning healthcare markets, and people can pay to jump the line and get important medical testing done immediately rather than waiting for a long time to see a specialist. Probably the best model for healthcare would be the Swiss model, which is entirely private with some subsidies for low-income individuals. A lot of the spending is done by people as opposed to the government. It's a very rich nation, very old nation, so they spend a lot of their own money on healthcare. Canada has got objectively poor results when it comes to hospital beds per 100,000 or doctors per 100,000. That has been improving a little bit in recent years. But the real issue is that, there's no political will to raise taxes, and costs are what they are, because the price to the end user is nothing. There's a large increase in frivolous demands, people going to see the doctor because they have a cough, because why not? You never know what it could be. So that drives up the price, and there's just not that much availability. So people end up waiting a long time to get any necessary medical treatment. Obviously, they can triage and emergencies get dealt with faster, but the whole system is monstrously inefficient. And the results, when compared to other OECD nations, are quite dismal. Actually, the best model for healthcare was the free market healthcare that existed in the United States to a large degree, especially before the 70s. There's now the American system isn't perfect either. The AMA serves as a cartel, limiting the supply of doctors, limiting the supply of medical schools and intern slots. So a lot of reforms could be made there, but still the U.S. healthcare system does provide excellent results, and a lot of medical technology has been invented by the Americans that the rest of the world sort of piggybacks on. The superiority of the private system is even more stark when you look at countries like Mexico, like Panama, like the Philippines. Third world countries usually have very good healthcare, private healthcare, and then the public systems obviously worse. Though in some cases they're still okay. You get the doctors working in both of them. It's just the speed which you get treated, and obviously the cost. Although in most countries outside of the United States, the cost for accessing private healthcare is still quite reasonable. You're talking like a couple $100 for a hospital visit, a consultation with a doctor, that sort of thing. The real problem, one of the real problems, the American system was the introduction of Medicare and Medicaid, and now that you have this massive artificial demand for medical services that can be overcharged because the taxpayer is picking up the tab. So one of the big problems at the American system is there's too much public spending on healthcare. Actually, spend almost as much per person as say Canada or other nations do. Looking at just government expenditure. Long story short, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Social spending does come at the expense of economic growth. Maybe there's no direct correlation between negative GDP growth and large amounts of government social spending, but since government spending is one of the factors in GDP, that you wouldn't necessarily expect that an increase in government spending would decrease GDP. Quite the opposite. So it's important to understand what the GDP figure is and what it's not. Though people like to claim that it's a measure of the economy, and certainly there's rough correlation between the size of an economy and GDP. It doesn't mean that an increase in GDP means the economy is improving necessarily. Although over time, if GDP tripled over 2 decades, yes, the economy would have grown, but just because GDP goes up in 1 year doesn't mean you're necessarily making the right steps. Government spending, in general, does take wealth from the economic class and redistributes it to the political class for consumption. So this does retard economic growth in the long run, because economic growth really comes from people saving their income, investing it, and capital stock being accumulated. So for that, you need non-inflationary monetary policy. That's another topic for another day. Overall, I find the case by unlearning economics that there is free stuff is good actually to be uncompelling, and it actually is not good. Well, what we should do is reduce government spending, have less free stuff, less taxes, and let people spend their own money on themselves, and get out of this idea that the government should be centrally planning the economy and deciding what goes where, what not. To the degree that you have to have any sort of government program, it's best to be targeted toward the poor instead of a universal system that's not means tested. Let it be as redistributive as it has to be to help the very bottom layer, and then and let everybody else be subject to the market and the benefits of market competition. Let's not choose state monopoly, socialism, and inferior results from the public system.